Morning. When I have to stop after walking in to recomb my hair, you know it's windy out there. It's brisk. Okay, ready? The U.S. Congress's Republican senators and representatives and President Trump are striking another blow against our country's future economic prosperity by cutting taxes, especially for the rich, large corporations, and powerful special interests. Over half of their proposed tax cuts will go to the wealthiest 1% of Americans whose annual incomes average more than $730,000 a year. They're trying to say with a straight face that their multi-trillion-dollar, quote, tax reform will trigger so much new economic growth that it will largely pay for itself. That promise was shown to be pure fiction after President Reagan cut taxes in 1981. He caused enormous increases in the federal deficit when the promised economic boom failed to appear. It's what President George H.W. Bush called voodoo economics. I was serving in the U.S. Senate when President George W. Bush perpetrated the same hoax with two enormous tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. President Bill Clinton has spent the previous 8 years balancing the federal budget, and forecasts predicted annual surpluses for the next decade. President Bush's huge tax cut and giveaways did not prompt a surge in economic growth. In fact, they were followed shortly by a seismic economic collapse, the Great Recession. Those forecasted federal budget surpluses were twisted into massive budget deficits. They have persisted even during the modest economic growth of the past few years. Last year's federal budget deficit was $666 billion. Those previous fiscal fiascos should tell us that Congress's present tax follies will make future deficits even worse and add to the federal government's debt, which now exceeds $20 trillion. Furthermore, their current tax bill is shamefully biased against lower and middle class families. In fact, by 2027, the richest 1% of Americans would receive nearly 80% of the bill's tax benefits, while lower and middle class taxpayers would receive 13%. One of their most offensive proposals would eliminate the deductibility of Minnesota's state income and sales taxes and local property taxes from our citizens' federal tax liabilities. It would completely remove these important tax deductions, which total over $12.3 billion per year for 900,000 Minnesota families. Over one-third of Minnesotans claim those deductions, including 40% of the residents in the 3rd Congressional District, 39% in the 6th Congressional District, and 43% in the 2nd Congressional District. Yet the 3 congressmen who represent those districts voted in favor of the House bill. I note that 20 House Republicans voted against the bill because eliminating the state and local tax deductions would have harmed so many of their constituents. And I will be writing the 3 members of Congress from Minnesota today and asking them to stand with those others in states that will be adversely affected and oppose the elimination of this tax, as a tax deduction. I strongly urge President Trump and Republicans in Congress to abandon this and other extremely regressive tax proposals. Any so-called, quote, tax reforms must do nothing to worsen our nation's fiscal stability and be focused on improving the lives and fortunes of low and middle income families, not a handful of the super wealthy. And I want to make the connection with what is going on here in Minnesota. The same thing, this tax cut frenzy, without regard to the effect on the budgets, federal and state, is a short-term giveaway which will whet people's appetites. Those are the beneficiaries for even more. But then they're going to just drive us deeper into debt and undermine the fiscal stability upon which our nation's well-being and our state's well-being depend. Glad to answer questions on this subject, and then we'll switch to anything else.
Is there anything in the federal tax proposal that would help Minnesotans?
Well, I mean, if in isolation, if they lower the income tax brackets, or those rates, that will certainly benefit. people, but you have to look and say what are they offset? What are they doing to offset that? That's where the state and federal, state and local tax deduction kicks in. They're talking about a net loss of $1.3 trillion estimated, but that doesn't include $5 trillion of federal spending cuts, $500 billion a year. Is that correct, that number?
The total budget is 2.4. The total budget resolution is 2.4. So over 10 years, that's, we can double check that figure.
All right, well, double, but you know, which they haven't detailed in the, so they're setting up for massive budget cuts, which will impact Minnesota severely. And one of the reasons I focus on this state and local tax deduction, Minnesota is the 9th highest beneficiary of this deduction. It's one of the relatively few that benefits Minnesota more than most other states. And what they're going to do is take that away and shift it all over to an increase in the standard deduction, which goes across the country, which benefits everybody equally. We get 90 cents back out of every dollar we send to Washington, the federal government, in benefits and other payments. And we're one of the, ranked 48th among the states, 48th lowest, in 48th worst in the differential between what we pay in federal taxes and what our citizens receive back. So this just exacerbates that situation and benefits other states that are already coming out ahead in terms of what they get back from the federal government. It benefits them more than states like Minnesota.
Well, Governor, the Republicans are arguing that by cutting these taxes, it's going to generate a tremendous amount of economic activity, closing loopholes will make it simpler, and that there will be more jobs, more taxes paid, and everybody's going to benefit. Overall, the taxes will come out even.
Well, it didn't work in 1981 when Ronald Reagan said that was the reason he was doing it. And then his person running against him actually in 1980 became his vice president, George H.W. Bush, called it voodoo economics. It didn't happen in 2001, 2003 when President George W. Bush cut the federal taxes by enormous amounts and took projected budget surpluses into major deficits for the next decade, which have continued to this day. It hasn't worked that way. And so I'm amazed that they can even say with a straight face that they're going to regain this $1.3 trillion in tax reductions by economic growth and jobs, et cetera. It hasn't been proven to be the case in the past. There's no reason to believe it would be the case this time.
What about cutting the corporate taxes from 35 to 20% or whatever it ends up being? They say that this is going to generate activity, bring money back from overseas, and give families a $4,000 raise.
Well, there may be merit in cutting the federal tax because it applies most onerously to small, medium-sized businesses. Large corporations don't pay 35%; they don't pay 20%. With all the deductions and all the loopholes, they pay a fraction of that in federal taxes. So closing some of those loopholes that advantage foreign investment rather than U.S. I mean, there are ways you could change the corporate tax structure that would be beneficial, but I don't think that's going to follow. But the notion that this translates into job creation again just hasn't happened. It just didn't happen.
I'm sorry, the salary hike for families, $4,000.
Well, that's some version of trickle-down economics, which hasn't occurred in the past. And corporations make investments because they think they'll realize future profits, and they reach 70% of our nation's economy is consumer-driven. So the way to get more economic growth is what we're doing here in Minnesota: invest in education, invest in infrastructure improvements, and do the things that are going to benefit everybody in this country, not just a favored few.
Other questions on this topic?
And $12.3 billion is the actual amount that would be lost in a year.
That's what Minnesotans, the 900,000 who take the itemized deduction, gain from this provision.
So what would you say that's going to do to the economy?
Well, that's money that doesn't go to Washington. You know, the other thing that's unfair about this is people already paid this part of their income to the state and local governments in taxes. in income, and in some states sales, and in property taxes. So they already been paid. They've already been taxed on that part of their income, and now they're going to be taxed again. So you can deduct that. So at least when the federal government says, okay, you've been taxed once, we're not going to do it again. Now they're going to tax it at the federal level a second time. So it's really inequitable, and it really is going to be very damaging for states, which is why 20 Republican members of Congress saw what was going to happen in their states. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. This should be about what's best for Minnesota. And this is one of the relatively few federal tax breaks that Minnesota gets more than most other states, because we have a higher income and therefore higher federal tax liabilities. But
what will this mean to the economy? Is it going to mean
nothing.
Loss of jobs?
It's going to mean, well, the stock market went up, the bank shares went up. It's going to mean more profits for corporations. It's going to mean if they do repatriate some money, the more money that they can invest, but whether they'll invest that in the United States growth or overseas again. I mean, it's just a circuitous path to get to jobs and investment in this country that's going to employ more people or raise people's incomes. It just hasn't happened before. It's a convenient theory. As I say, it masks the real effect of this. The part that goes to the people who already have so much. There was an article the other day about the Gilded Age. The number of billionaires is just astronomically high. The disparity between the super rich and the rest of the country, the rest of the world, is just staggering. And then we don't connect that to things like the achievement gap and other things where people have been forced into impoverished circumstances. Well, but more is never enough. More is never enough. That people who have so much always want more.
One more tax question. Have you or the Revenue Department calculated what impact taxing 401ks might have if the tax bill actually does begin taxing them above 24?
I don't know if we haven't done an assessment of the of the cost, but certainly, again, I mean that's a mechanism that serves middle income as well as upper income people. And it's another one of these trade-offs that they're making that disadvantages people who we should be encouraging people to save for their retirement, not discouraging it.
Do you know how much Minnesotans pay in federal taxes a year?
We'll get you that number.
Governor, you can argue on paper how this will only benefit the wealthiest Americans, but the fact remains that there are a lot of working class Americans and Minnesotans who are calling for tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. And how do you reconcile what you see as what will be the result of this and some popular support for these kinds of cuts?
Well, cut taxes for lower and middle income people. And focus the tax cuts, whether it be here in Minnesota or in Washington, on people whose standard of living has been flattened or even gone down, and who need and deserve tax reduction as a way to put more money in their pockets. That stimulates the economy, because then they'll spend that money on necessities, and that, again, 70% of our economy is driven by consumer spending. But eliminating the estate tax, or eliminating the alternative minimum tax, or doing some of these other gimmicks which are far more impactful in terms of the revenue loss, it's just unjustifiable.
Good on this topic?
Any other topics?
Governor,
She raised her hand.
A much more local topic. Governor, I was wondering, many Minnesota politicians have weighed in on the situation in the St. Paul mayor's race, where there's a political attack attempting to connect the theft of guns from Melvin Carter's home with a rise in gun violence in the city. I was wondering, since you endorsed Melvin, if you had any comment on that topic.
I think it's been said. I think Mayor Coleman, who I respect highly, it made a much more in-depth assessment of the letter, the charges. It's just very unfortunate that it's injected that kind of negativity and that kind of racial bias into a mayor's race. I support Melvin for many positive reasons. And I think he'd be an outstanding mayor.
Governor, this morning's indictment on Paul Manafort, I'm just wondering what kind of impact you think that might have on the president's ability to govern.
Boy, I wouldn't hazard a guess on what impact anything has on the president's. You have to check at 3 a.m. to deduce that. You know, if this is the first of the series, I don't know what the charges are, but you know, there's some talk now that they want Mueller to be fired or removed, and this just underscores the imperative to continue with this, and as it unfolds, and see what the charges are and see what's proven.
Other questions?
Governor, Lieutenant Governor Smith is in Duluth today talking about the Minnesota Care buy-in. How big a priority is that for you in the 2018 session?
Well, we'll see. I think it's a really good idea because I think it's going to broaden the options for Minnesotans who now have very limited, or in some cases, the only one provider to choose from. And the competition will bring costs down. But I want to focus on Minnesota Care and the buy-in that begins on Wednesday. And there have been a couple of stories, national and state, already written that note how much better off Minnesota is to have a state-run exchange than the federal, where they're undermining, sabotaging the efforts there, the marketing, the assistance for people to access. I mean, they're just trying to savage Affordable Care Act and make it worse. Whereas it is the law, they haven't come up with anything to replace the law, and so we should be doing in this country what we're doing here in Minnesota, which is make the law work as well as possible for the people of Minnesota. And Minnesota Care is focused on that, and we'll see what the results are over the next 3 months when we see what kind of opportunities people have. But for now, I'm very enthusiastic about MNsure's progress, and I'm very looking forward to seeing how they perform. I think it'll be really a very, very good benefit for Minnesota. And if you compare it with what's going to happen in these other states that are on the federal exchange, it's night and day. So we'll see. We'll see about the next legislative session.
Governor, have you discussed or thought at all about how long a state-run exchange will be able to continue operating under this, the direction that the federal government is going, or is that the next governor's problem to sort out?
Well, it'll impact the next governor and next legislature, and it'll impact the people of Minnesota, most importantly. I mean, they're just trying to, the president's just undermining the financial underpinnings of the Affordable Care Act, trying to, I guess, make it do worse or collapse. With the, existing funding, Minnesota's in a secure position if we keep our enrollment up, which is again what focus will be for over the next open enrollment period. But I can't predict what they're going to do in terms of the refunds for insurance and the reduction in marketing, the reduction in assistance. I mean, they're just systematically whacking away. They don't have a better alternative. So they're just going to try to make Minnesota Care try to make the Affordable Care Act look worse and provide less quality service to Americans, which is deplorable.
Related to that, President Trump has said Obamacare is dead. Don't even call it that anymore. He has been cutting some of the Navigator funds, all of that stuff. Are you concerned that Minnesotans are going to think that they don't have to sign up, or are you concerned that it will depress the sign-ups?
Well, I think Minnesotans are most aware of what's communicated to them here in Minnesota, and that's why MNsure is really ramped up, and they have a marketing budget, and they're, there is certainly uncertainty given the headlines about the proposed cuts, MNsure and Minnesota Care and the like. So there is some anxiety and confusion. That's why they're redoubling their efforts, and with their navigators, really be hands-on, helping people understand that this program is still available. It's going to benefit them and help them through it. But it's certainly, whatever they do to destabilize the whole Affordable Care Act nationally is going to have a negative effect on Minnesota. There's no doubt.
For you folks
folks still talking to Washington about Minnesota Care funding?
We are. We had a conference call last week with CMS Administrator Seema Verma, and Senator Klobuchar, Senator Franken, and Representative Emmer joined the call with me and her. I can't say we made progress. She believes that she says her legal counsel, which is not in CMS, which is part of the parent agency, Health and Human Services, has told her that the law is clear that she cannot continue the funding, which goes contrary to what we were told by lawyers and staff all last spring, that we could structure this program in a way that it would not adversely affect the federal funding. So they flipped that, and we said, well, can we meet with or talk with the lawyers? Well, she wasn't sure that they would agree to do that, because our legal interpretation is very different. We believe that the law says clearly she does have the discretion to provide the funding that, again, her staff and legal counsel last spring was telling us would not be affected by this reinsurance. So it's still jumbled. I don't frankly think the administration wants to provide. I think it's part of, again, they're just undermining these programs that have been put in place that are successful. And Minnesota Care was passed over 25 years ago, bipartisan support under Governor Arnie Carlson. You know, it's been a very amazingly successful, life-saving program for so many Minnesotans. And the fact that they want to destabilize or defund it is really, really immoral. But, you know, they'll make the Senate version. Senator Klobuchar and Senator Franken have been working very closely with Senator Lamar Alexander, who chairs the Senate Health and Human Services, whatever it's called, the committee. And he is putting into the Alexander Patty Murray bill, bipartisan bill, which has generated a fair amount of bipartisan support in the Senate, and that would restore the funding. And that's one of the reasons we talked with Congressman Emmer, who's been very supportive, very helpful on this, as is the entire Minnesota delegation, to get the House to go along with that if it goes forward. So I think there's, you know, if the bill passes, which is speculative as anything is in Washington, I think there's a reasonably good chance that that money will be restored through congressional action, and that'll clear it up for good. Well, not for good. Clear it up for now.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you.